Hi, everyone. When knowing your enemy is as important as knowing yourself, you can use attribution to better follow investigations, better understand the implications of incidents, and better defend your organization. My name is Mike Worley. My colleague Steve Miller is the person you see on some of the programs and on the list out there. He's the reason this is up here, but was unable to travel today. So I'm happy to be here to talk a little bit more about using attribution effectively. One of the first questions we get when we see a cyber attack is, what happened? One of the next questions we get, almost invariably, is who is behind the cyber attack? What did they want? Why were they doing it? To start, just to set the stage a little bit for this discussion, talking about attribution, I just want to run through a couple of well-known examples. These are not going to be a surprise to anybody, starting with the 2017 Triton attack that affected petrochemical facilities' safety systems. We attributed that to UNC 878, also known as Tempvelis bias, and Xenotime is another name that was that Dragos uses to discuss that activity and threat actor behind it. This is just one of a whole slew of examples of ICS tailored malware or wipers being used against Ukrainian energy assets. That has been attributed to Sandworm, also known as UAC82 or APT44, which you graduated to this past year, or Electrum. And then most recently, the use of Frosty Goop malware to take out, that was reportedly used to affect heating systems in Lviv last winter in Ukraine there. More nebulously than the others, maybe just attributed to Russia. The point here is that when there's a cyber attack, attribution is everywhere. It's in cybersecurity products and services. You see it in media, info sharing, victim notifications, government and law enforcement advisories. So while it may be in all those places, we don't necessarily all agree on the value of it. And maybe that's because we don't all do it, maybe because we have different ways of thinking about it. Attribution can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It comes in different forms and varying levels of specificity. We happen to think it's best to think of attribution as a spectrum of information about an adversary behind an attack. Depending on where you are in that incident response, what's going on, what information you have access to, you might be at a different point on that spectrum. And just as attribution isn't necessarily one thing, the organizations that are consuming it and the people who are looking to get information about attribution are not one thing. It can be used for a lot of different people by a lot of different people across an organization and consumed differently for different purposes. So on that spectrum, we start at the totally unknown and moves all the way up to the totally known. At the bottom here is where you generally are starting out with an investigation. And you don't have any sense of, maybe you just heard about, you're just starting your incident response. And maybe at this point you start, as you dig into it, you start seeing file wipers kind of being deployed across your network. You're starting to get a sense maybe that we're looking at something destructive. Maybe then you start ruling out something like a financial motivation, ransomware or extortion, when you start seeing TTPs that might look more like what you expect from a state-backed APT group. Then, let's say you have a EDR, your vendor tells you, hey, we have a report out. We think this high confidence, we're attributing this to a Russian-backed actor. At this point, those building blocks of attribution are starting to build up. You're moving from that low-resolution image of what the adversary might be or who might be behind it, to getting a little bit higher resolution of what that adversary or who might be attacking you. Next, say you got, in collaboration with the law enforcement agency, you get the named actor APT44. This can be particularly helpful. We know these are reported to be sponsored by the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. So we get a sense of what that, as a full spectrum threat actor, what these guys do, right? They conduct espionage, cyber-enabled influence, and attack operations. So you're starting to get a sense of, this could be pretty bad, right? At this point, we would kind of say that this is a high-resolution attribution, probably where the lion's share of one organization is going to get and really can make use of. This spectrum can go on. It can be a persona. It can be an individual, a named individual as well. That might not necessarily be of particular use to you, and usually the remit of a government or international law enforcement, whatever. But that doesn't necessarily play too much in the discussion today. All I wanted to kind of highlight here is that this spectrum is it's a process, right? You start from a low resolution, you start from nothing, and you start to build through these building blocks of attribution a little bit of better understanding of that adversary, who they are, what they might want to do to you. And each point along that spectrum can be useful if you know what you're doing with it. So to look a little bit more at that high resolution named group attribution, we can talk about a few of the ways that some of these teams can actually put that into use. Say you have a phishing incident, and you learn at some point, whether it's from an advisory or from the media, you learn that APT44 it's been attributed to APT44. That might be all that you need in order to say, hey, look, we thought it was a phishing incident, we thought we were all done, but let's just go double check, right? So your SOC, IR, and threat hunters might go and take that just to double check, make sure that this known, real bad actor with a lot of capabilities is doing this phish. So how do we go about doing that? With that attribution to APT44, not all threat groups are alike. Different ones have different TTPs. They use different. They're motivated differently. They have different people behind the keyboards going out there and trying to run their operations. For APT44, these are some of the things that they do. Right? They imitate brand names. They have IPs in certain places. They love to use VPN and Tor. These are some of the things that are going to show up on your network. They also love scheduled tasks for persistence. They have a set of malware that they love to use as well. In running their operations, and they have a history of OT-tailored malware. Some of the endpoint TTPs. So when we look at this, it might not necessarily be the most unique. Some of it is, right? OT-tailored malware, not everyone's running that. But you might see this and think, okay, we've got this as this group, but when you start stacking it up against a different if we take 28 as one example, as another GRU-sponsored threat group, and you start to see the differences when you compare them. So they might imitate brands, there might be different brands. They prefer RDP over VPNs, they prefer registry persistence to scheduled tasks. They have a different set of malware that they usually use, and no OT-tailored history. So being able to break down and say, okay, we've got one name group versus another, you start to get a sense of what kinds of actions you're going to be able to take that are going to be different for each of these individual groups. On the imitating of brand names for phishing and C2 domains, you might be querying Splunk logs for domains that contain those keywords. Running searches for alerts on Tor across your SIM, or grabbing a list of the Tor IPs from around the time of that activity to see if there's any other malicious or suspicious activity from those. You might be collecting scheduled tasks, examining those binaries, and then you're reviewing other alerts for any malware detections that hit on this family of malware. Down on the OT-tailored malware front, maybe you would know from what APT44's previous operations are that they like to abuse particular protocols in that malware. So maybe you go look for alerts on anything that would be ISC 101 or 104 across engineering workstations closer down to your OTDMZ. All of these steps are going to be a lot different if we're talking about 28. You'll be looking for inbound network connections over port 3389, not necessarily concerning yourself with the Tor as much. It might even raise interesting questions. Do we have the visibility that we need in order to find these guys? Their preference for registry, you'll be looking for Windows service events, and then this batch of malware is going to be a different kinds of detections that you need to run through it, and as compared to 44s, and you're looking for network tunneling anomalies, and you're not necessarily, again, looking for that OT-tailored malware. So the point here is that these two groups, when it comes down to name group attribution, it's going to depend on what that threat group is, how they operate. You're not necessarily it's not necessarily up to you to know all of these individual things, right? Security technologies and your vendors should be able to provide you with the information, IOCs and other things, to be able to say, this is how we suggest you do it, this is how it can become repeatable and scalable, so you can run this and protect yourself. And in terms of running those things, you've got to get the information into the hands of the right people in order to do their job as most effectively as possible and as quickly as possible. So that you're trying to save the defenders time and energy and direct them in the right place so they can do their job most effectively. So all that's great. When you have a named adversary, you know exactly what we're talking about. We have a whole list of TTPs, and we can go out and take care of them really easily, maybe. Or maybe not really easily, but we know what we're doing. One step down that spectrum, you start to get down to something a little lower resolution. Maybe we're at a state nexus. I'm going to keep running with this Russia theme throughout here, but say we're looking at password spray activity, and it gets attributed to Russia. So it might, on the face of it, not necessarily be as readily actionable as attribution to a named group, right? But there's certain things that can be, this is where different consumers come into play, and this is where you start to get a sense of how else are we going to use attribution that might not be most readily apparent to us. So anytime a state, foreign state, or government is linked to a cyber attack, you get into the world of geopolitics. And there's not many boardrooms around the world that aren't necessarily concerned about that. So when we're looking at a state nexus, maybe executives are the ones who are going to be the most interested in this. General counsel, PR, CISO, and all those other suits, I guess, or P coats like this emoji is showing us here. But these are some of the things they might be doing with that information, right? They know Russia is the attribution. Let's monitor some geopolitical ongoings in that region. What kind of investments do we have in the Caucasus, Central Asia, former Soviet Union republics? Maybe if we're talking password spray activity, maybe we should be pushing up that MFA rollout to combat that. So defenders down at the lower levels aren't necessarily dealing with the types of risk that executives might be dealing with. So they don't maybe it's not as clear, again, what that attribution is going to be used for, how we can do it. But if you can provide that as a defender, if you get that attribution, that information, and you kick it up to the people who can do something with it, you're starting to inform strategic business operations and really demonstrating value there. That's not the only thing, obviously, you can do with it. You can start, and at the defender level, there's other ways to start enumerating likely suspects, and again, getting us focused as quickly as possible on doing the job that is going to be most effective in whether it's remediating and responding to an incident from that actor. In terms of enumerating likely suspects, some questions that you can ask, whether it's to your internal threat intel team or to your vendor, who are the prominent Russian actors? Who's active right now? Who's been active the last year and a half or two? Who's typically targeting my industry? Who's often targeting my region? And then down to the nitty-gritty of who's doing password spraying more often and who's attacked me before. All of these questions can help you to start narrowing down the field of possible suspects, all of Russia, all Russian attributed groups, down to those that might be the most relevant threats to you. So at that point, maybe you've got 3 or 4, but it's better than the 10 or 12 that you might have dealt with otherwise. And you can start working through that same level of that higher resolution attribution, those actions that you would take there. And again, all in the name of getting people onto the right target and doing the right things as quickly as possible. So high resolution attribution is great. We can make use of that maybe more strategic, but the lower resolution state-backed attribution. But what happens when we don't really have any of that? Maybe it's right at the beginning, we're just stumped. So it helps to start getting just a basic lay of the land. What kind of activity are we looking at here, right? Is this a group that's here to wreak some havoc? Are they just trying to make a name for themselves? Just smash and make some noise? Are they maybe we see a deployment of System BC and Cobalt Strike, and they're dumping creds from a domain controller. Better start warning somebody that's probably they're here for money. Or maybe it's got somebody, maybe we're looking at something that, again, has that has a sense that there's something more to this activity, it's more sophisticated, and they're looking like they might be snooping around. Depending on that, your actions are going to be a lot different, right? When it comes to a hacktivist, if you determine that's what this is looking like, it might be checking default passwords, ensuring your basic cybersecurity hygiene practices are in place and working, and then moving on. If we are talking about an imminent ransomware event, maybe you should be getting ready to cut the cord to OT, but you're certainly warning others to get your ransomware playbook in rolling. And then on the unknown APT, that's where we're homing in on, we think this might be an APT, this is something state-backed. How do we get a sense of what their end goal might be? Is it espionage, pre-positioning? Might it be for destructive purposes? To get to try to answer some of these questions, we actually spend a lot of our time there on the cyber physical threat intel team. We're seeing a lot of activity. We actually spend probably most of our time on the hacktivist front. I mean, it's just a constant flow of claims, counterclaims, reposting claims, and all that. Most of it is BS. But when it comes to unknown APT, we're trying to get a sense of if we see what we call ambiguous threat activity, trying to determine if that activity might be of relevance to an OT asset owner or defender. How do we get there? What are the questions we ask? So we developed this matrix just to kind of lay out, put some structure around how we think about that. The factors are listed across the top here. And from left to right, it's generally somewhat more useful or more diagnostic down to the less diagnostic and maybe more conditional upon other information. Just to run through some of these briefly here, right? So we've got targeting, looking at the sub-factors there are consistency and exclusivity. Are they consistently targeting, is this activity consistently targeting critical industries? Are they consistently targeting a particular region or just one critical industry or just one victim? Are they continually trying to come back and get access to the same victim? And then on the exclusivity side, similar. Is this exclusively against critical industries? Or is this something that maybe just one or two critical industries just happen to fall into the targeting list? So you can rank those, from consistent or exclusive down through unknown, down to not a consistent or exclusive to get you a start comparing it from high, moderate, or low risk. The next bit here, the next factor that we identify we look at is the level of access. And that's broken down into the depth of access versus the nature of the access. On the depth, that runs from the low risk of maybe an attempt at initial compromise, but no signs of actual successful compromise to an environment, to something a little bit more concerning might be your corporate networks, but not necessarily your OT, which is the high risk stuff, right? So if we're talking about them down in OT, what's the nature of the access to an OT environment? Is it collateral, which is maybe lower risk? Some say it's a piece of USB spreading malware that just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but doesn't necessarily pose a real risk to the availability of that system? Or is it maybe opportunistic, which might be a little bit more concerning? These actors get on your network and they start looking around and they find a default password and they move into the OT and they start looking like they're trying to do something on that system. Or is it explicit, where you get to that higher level of concern? Excuse me. That asterisk there is next to UNC 3236, which overlaps with what's publicly reported as Volt Typhoon. That would be a tripwire, what we would call a tripwire factor right there. Once we see explicit access to OT, that's high priority. We need to be writing up a report, getting this in front of our readers and saying, this is something you need to be aware of and trying to mitigate the threat. So the next two factors are the ones, as I kind of said, some of them might be a little bit, maybe it seems clunky to say, we have no attribution, but let's look at the attribution, right? But we think these are important because if you have a sense of what that group is, then great. But if you don't, then this is maybe your intelligence gap. It starts focusing you on where you need to focus a little bit of attention. In the case that you might have a sense of what the group is, and you can look at their prior objectives to get a sense of, again, determining whether that's a lower, moderate, or higher risk. If they have a history of espionage, like APT 29, or maybe it's financial motivation, they're out there just trying to make money, that might be of lower concern to a group that might be out there doing disruptive or destructive attack or have a history of that. Again, unknown is kind of in the middle there. So you might come back later and decide, at the moment, we don't know, so we're gonna treat it a little bit higher concern. But as we fill that gap and we start to get a sense of whether or not it's leaning one way or the other, that's where you come back to say, if we now learn that they have ICS-specific capabilities previously and they've conducted cyber-physical attacks, that starts to get even higher on that scale. And then within the geopolitical domain, those two sub-factors of the relationship, if known, between the victim and the perpetrating countries. Are those two states in cooperation? Are we talking about competition or outright conflict? And that's relevant because almost all those, all the big, well-known cyber-physical attacks in the past have mostly taken place in conflict zones or between countries that would be considered in conflict. And as for use case, the scale here ranges from strategic intelligence value down to solely prepositioning or destructive intent, right? This is something that might be strategic intelligence value is something like some ABT sponsored by a state that might have high dependence on energy and extractive industries, targeting targeting an oil and gas or industry or several victims across that industry. But if you can't really make an argument one way or the other, maybe it's leaning strategic intel value, but you could also make an argument that that's prepositioning. That gets you right down to that moderate point, and the high would be where at this case, if you're looking at activity that has absolutely no strategic intelligence value, and you're saying there's only one thing you can do with that, and this is to disrupt our OT environments, then that's your high risk score. So with this, we just put simple values, 0, 1, 2 to the green, yellow, and red boxes. And it just helps to get a sense of what activity, it helps us get a sense of what activity do we need to be alerting our readers about. If it's that high stuff where, again, we're writing a report, we're trying to get as much detail into that so people and defenders can go and actually do something to defend against it. If it's low, maybe it's on the lower end. Maybe that's something we're just going to write up and provide the context so somebody understands that it is low, it might pose a lower threat, right? But just to combat something like media hype. So in summary, attribution is there. We think we should try to make as good use of it as we can. We see attribution as a spectrum of information about the people that are behind an attack. We can use it to differentiate attacks, inform decisions, and prioritize investments, and ultimately spend defensive energy wisely. It comes in many form factors. It's useful to different people in different ways. And those consumers might not be readily apparent to you, but if it's not, make sure that you get it to somebody. If you see something you're not sure about the evaluate to you, get it into the hands of somebody who might be able to do something with it or might need to see it. And lastly, making good use of attribution demands that it be used with care. A lot of the level, if we were talking about the level of attribution here, most should probably buy that rather than DIY it if you don't have the resources dedicated to be able to do that. And that quality can vary by producer. So it's important to look for signs of good analytic tradecraft, things like estimative language, consideration of alternate hypotheses, things that are giving you a sense of identifying intelligence gaps and saying if we found, this gap is key to underpinning our assessment here. So if we find other information that contradicts it, we would be, we would have X confidence in this assessment, or we would need to reassess. Overall, though, what you're looking for is your attribution provider to give you what you need to succeed and drive your defensive efforts in the right direction as quickly as possible. So I have about 6 minutes here. I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Hey, good presentation on attribution. Always a fun topic. Joe Slowick here. Question for the context and nature of the event today for OT security. Certainly we could look at high-profile things like a Triton, APT-44, or whatever, and some of the events in question there. But I'm curious for the attribution. You talked about things like informing board-level decision-making or death cycle, IR, SOC, or whatever. But if we're talking about relatively less mature asset owners when it comes to the security space and even the ability to consume intelligence products, how would you apply this spectrum of attribution as laid out previously to relatively immature or less capable security organizations that nonetheless are in the crosshair of a UNC 323, or I forget the UNC for Volt Typhoon, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Sorry, I just got a little reverb. What was it? Did you say sectoral attribution?
So for relatively resource-poor entities in the critical infrastructure space, could be any sector, how could they best make use of attribution statements, or does it even become irrelevant at that stage of the game if you're talking about relatively immature security programs, but are nonetheless in the crosshairs of a Bolt Typhoon or similar?
Yeah. Fully agree, right? Like Steve and I were talking about this. This is like a little bit of attribution for the 10%, right? I mean, these are going to be the big organizations that are going to be able to do this. Maybe they have full teams that are dedicated to these things and they're able to do that. But yeah, a lot of times last year I mentioned hacktivism, and it started out right with that Muleshoe or Abernathy, whichever one it was. But that's most of the time we're seeing that kind of stuff kind of hitting that level of a system. And we are always talking about how they're under-resourced. They might not necessarily have the ability to respond to those, let alone prepare for it. But I think that we try to lay out here is that whatever the attribution might be along that way, it gives, and it doesn't need to be, go buy it from Dragos, go buy it from Mandy, go buy it from whoever you have to buy it from. There's other places. Attribution is in other places. It's in info sharing. Even if it's in media, right? It was the city manager or whatever, that was the one who said that there was somebody in the system, right? But you can still use, the point here is that you can use that you take those building blocks along the way and you try to find a way to take what information you've got to turn it into actions. And I think that's it doesn't, again, kind of why I was highlighting, we don't need to go down to a named individual. You don't necessarily need to even know that, say, APT 44 is GRU. It helps to get you a sense of what they might be out to do. But any point along that spectrum, we think that there's a way to take that piece of information, query it, and apply it to your benefit.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Great talk.
Yeah, thank you.